There are at least two kinds of readers in this world. Let's call them centripetal readers and centrifugal readers. Which one you are determines whether your reading actually builds into something substantial or just scatters into noise. And then there's the middle ground, which makes use of both kinds of reading. And this middle ground is exactly what turned one wandering reader into a best-selling author who sold over 320 million copies of his books. And the blending of these reading strategies is worth paying attention to, especially when you find out one secret in particular that made the biggest difference in the world. It's one of the most important tips that I've ever discovered. I'll tell you all the critical details about this author who sold so many books in a moment. But to get this right, and your reading right, so that you could make a heck of a lot more than mere money, understand this. This reading strategy that you're going to discover from this amazing author, it'll make you uncopyable. And being uncopyable means you can walk into a room and nobody can think the way you think. Not merely because nobody has read what you've read, but it's also because you connect ideas across domains in ways that only you and your brain can. But the real superpower, it's what you're trying to achieve in the end. And Louis L'Amour's #1 goal is going to surprise you. And the truth is that although Louis L'Amour became one of the most successful authors in history, it wasn't through talent or connections or formal education. He did it through deliberate strategies based in a particular kind of reading that then changed into yet another kind of reading. And by the end of today's video, you'll be able to map this strategy onto your own life. So L'Amour had a bit of schooling, but from a very young age, he took off and wandered. And he kept wandering for many, many years, picking up all kinds of jobs as he went. He worked on ships, in mines. He was a boxer. He even coached boxing teams. And everywhere he went, he read by firelight, in laundry rooms, on cargo ships. And he read whatever he could find, wherever he could find it. And he had a line that I love. This is so important. He said that for a book to deserve his attention, its only qualification was that it had to be a book. To be a book gave it dignity enough. If that sounds a bit romantic, well, that's probably because it is, but there's an actionable lesson in it. L'Amour wasn't just reading randomly, even if he was reading serendipitously or centrifugally. I know these are fun words, right? But these are words that just don't get used often enough. He's reading just by the joy and the love of actually picking up the book and reading. And even during his wandering years, he's also being quite specific in his reading, because L'Amour wanted to write from a young age, and he said he was conditioning himself. So his reading was a means for preparing for the process. And as he says, you prepare for the process and then you let the process proceed. So by reading centrifugally with no particular center, or serendipitously just reading whatever he could find, he was creating this inner reservoir so deep that when he finally did sit down to write, the stories didn't have to be manufactured. They were already there, formed by thousands of books, conversations, and miles of lived experience, all feeding into one central gravitational purpose. And that's the centripetal part, but there's more on that coming soon. The random reading, it may well have been centrifugal in appearance, just going all over the place with no center, but L'Amour was becoming centripetal without even knowing the term. And he talks a lot in this book about how the unconscious was something he could access and would guide him. And that's partly because it was programmed with this deep reservoir of seemingly random reading, but always towards this kind of goal of becoming a writer one day. And the practical piece that you can use right now is to think about L'Amour's reading in 3 distinct phases. And you can probably see yourself in them in your life already, but by being more aware of them, you can use them to move forward in your life. So the first phase is to read omnivorously. Give every book, as Lemore says, its dignity. What does that mean more practically? Well, it's the old don't judge a book by its cover rule, but also don't judge the writing style or the content of the book too early either. So often we get impatient. Oh, this style doesn't gel with me, or this is too difficult, or this is not up my alley or my cup of tea. Well, try to read in a way where you just don't filter out stuff so quickly, because often it takes time to get used to a style or to get used to a topic area you don't understand. Believe me, I've read plenty of really poorly written books that were still packed with astonishingly valuable gems, but I never would have discovered them if I hadn't given the book more time for me to acclimatize to its style. And then it often turns out that it wasn't that bad after all. And as you're going through this wandering phase, omnivorous phase, it's so essential to find stuff that is not necessarily your cup of tea. So, ask yourself, what am I curious about right now? Then follow that curiosity and don't feel guilty about it, but be willing to go through books that might feel like they're a waste of time sometimes, because it's impossible to know when in the future that exposure might pay off. And even if it never does, going through the exercise of reading material, it will develop your pattern recognition skills, if anything else. As Alan Moore says in his BBC storytelling class, if you want to know what's good, you've got to go through a lot of bad. All right, so before I get into the second phase and a powerful set of strategies you can start copying today, if we haven't met before, this is Dr. Anthony Metivier from Magnetic Mary Method. And if you're the kind of person who wants to build something real from your studying, from not just books, but a variety of media, instead of just collecting interesting ideas that evaporate, and you would like to remember more and see the world get better and better for one and all through mental training and memory improvement, smash that thumbs up and get subscribed if you're new here, and enable those notifications so you don't miss a thing, because when you do, it helps me reach more people who deserve to know that their struggle with learning isn't a personal failing. It's not a failing at all. It might be a structural issue, and it's a structural issue that a lot of people don't even know exist. And that structure is exactly what we've already started fixing today. So let's raise all ships together. Thumbs up for that. And that was Louis L'Amour's mission too, to make the world a better place. So let's get into phase 2, which is the consolidation phase. Now, there are two ways you can think of the consolidation phase. One is very simple. You go to sleep and you remember. That's what memory consolidation is all about. But for Louis L'Amour, the consolidation phase and the omnivorous reading phase, it came to an end eventually. He stopped wandering as a reader, and he settled down and he built a library. But not just any kind of library. As L'Amour puts it, he didn't collect books for his library because they looked pretty and came in a series with matching bindings. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but L'Amour collected what he called battered old veterans, books chosen specifically because they served his purpose, his centripetal purpose, something that had a deep center that everything was pointing towards. He was now all about writing books dedicated to describing the American frontier. So he gathered and read journals, diaries, old maps, pamphlets, primary sources written by people who had actually lived through the frontier experiences that he wanted to read about. And he moved from reading serendipitously or centrifugally to having an element of sacrifice, reading with greater focus and care. And this is so important because in making sacrifices, he also didn't just read about the frontier and collect a library in that form, but he actually went to real places and talked to people who remembered their grandparents' stories. In a way, he treated the entire world like a book, kind of like the medieval people did, believing that they could read reality itself as if it were made out of words. Then came the third phase, which is that let's raise all ships phase. L'Amour believed that knowledge, like money, must circulate, It's not enough to have learned, he said. You have to share what you've learned. And for him, that meant more than just writing novels. He had stage fright like crazy. He tried to cancel his first speaking engagement, but once he allowed himself to learn a little bit about what was involved in speaking, he gave lots of talks and helped a lot of people. And then he ultimately wrote Education of a Wandering Man to help other people understand how that he came to write and sell so many books. And as part of this incredible act of sharing, Louis L'Amour includes a section at the back of this book that goes far beyond his story. The reading list at the back of this book, it is amazing. He lists dozens and dozens of books, and I have some of them in my own library, which was really, really amazing. And when you look at the list, you can see both the scatter and the focus. Early on, it's everything: philosophy, poetry, history, fiction from all over the world, even Nietzsche, which totally blew me away. And I can't wait to share with you what comes out of Nietzsche, because it's really the ultimate secret. But by his later years, the reading becomes more concentrated. He even talked about not having classics in that library that he built for himself, just research material, the battered old veterans. I love that term. That's the centrifugal-centripetal arc in action, starting off omnivorous and then getting more and more focused. And now that you understand this arc, you can turn this understanding into strategy. And Education of a Wandering Man is that. It's a playbook for how to read in these two different ways and focus it all towards achieving substantial goals, the real desires you hold in your heart as the emerging architect of your dreams and fantasies. But real desire is very, very important. And we're getting to Louis L'Amour's real desire, and it's mind-blowing and so important. But let's start with strategy 1. He says that questions must be formed by knowledge. Well, that line stopped me cold, because I had never quite thought about the questioning process in that way before. I've talked on this channel before about questioning, especially with reference to the memory wheels of Bruno and Llull and Giordano Bruno, which involve critical thinking and memory techniques and these rotational strategies. But in this particular case, what I think L'Amour means is that the quality of the questions you're capable of asking is determined by the depth of what you've already read. So if you've read nothing about medicine, you can't ask your doctor a very informed question. You might not even think to ask any questions at all, or if you wanted to ask questions, you might not have the vocabulary that can help you reach through the darkness to enunciate or elaborate what's on your mind, and then you wind up just sitting there still and getting nowhere. If you've read nothing about the law, you can't evaluate legal advice. If you've read nothing about history, you can't see the patterns repeating in front of you. So this is why that omnivorous centrifugal reading phase really, really matters. It gives you the raw material to form better questions. And better questions lead to deeper reading, which leads to better questions still. It's a flywheel, but it only spins if you're actually retaining what you've read. Unless, of course, they have the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass and attend my live boot camps, and there's always a new one coming up soon. So when you read and you feel the excitement, and 3 weeks later, you can still recall the titles of the books and the articles and the content, well, this is a powerful way to have an incredible life. And, you know, Louis L'Amour talks about memory quite a bit, and it's just an astonishing memory that he must have had, but he didn't rely on his memory in the same way I don't rely entirely on my memory. One of the reasons why I consolidate my own centripetal library is so that I don't have to memorize everything. But let's go on to strategy number 2. This is really, really important, and I have evidence of it all around me myself. Go to the lesser known books. L'Amour was adamant about this. He said that to really learn, you have to find the obscure books, not the bestsellers, not the books that everyone's reading, the primary sources, the forgotten journals, the diaries of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. It's the same thing with popular media, like podcasts, YouTube channels, and whatever account has millions of followers. Yes, they can add tremendous value, be incredibly entertaining, but think about it. So if you only read what everyone else is reading, and if you only view what everyone else is viewing, well, then you can only ever think what everyone else thinks. And Louis L'Amour avoided this problem by going deep into these fringe materials, the diaries of people who actually crossed the frontier. I know when I was in university, I somehow fell into reading these books of correspondence. So when I was taking courses in literature, I would read the correspondence between James Joyce and T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. And these are just the most extraordinary primary documents that say far more than any of their poetry ever would on its own. And so Lamore said that he read deeply so he could not escape the lives and the stories of the people he was studying. And I found that myself by reading letters. This depth of the inability to escape is what ultimately made Louis L'Amour's fiction seem so real to people. And the same principle applies to whatever it is you're building. If you want your work to be uncopyable, your inputs have to be uncopyable too. And so that means consuming what nobody else is consuming. Is some of it going to be unprofessional and unpolished? Yes. Is some of it going to be a bit tedious and repetitive and boring? Absolutely. But I myself make a point of going through that kind of material because L'Amour's right. That's where the real deal is going to be found. Now, the third strategy is to read for feelings, not just for facts. Now, I just mentioned how important real research and facts are, but that doesn't mean we discount subjective experience. L'Amour read all these diaries, not just for the information, but to find out what it felt like to cross a river in winter, what the light looked like at dawn over a mesa, what fear tasted like when you heard the hooves of an enemy behind you. And in my own work with memory, I've read about the successes and the failures, and I turned the lens on myself to figure out my own feelings. For example, there was a polymath named Athanasius Kircher, and he made a lot of claims at one point, and he was ultimately outed for not really being able to stand up to all of those claims. And that's always made me feel very, very cautious and careful. Sometimes extreme to the point that, when people ask me how many languages I speak, I always just say I'm not even fluent in my own mother tongue, which is true. But Kircher, he had a different emotion of pride, and that pride messed with him. And that colored his reading in ways that have made Kircher's books irrelevant in our time, mostly irrelevant. I mean, they're cultural and historical curiosities, to be sure, but we can't trust a thing in them. Anyway, I'm going to profile Kircher at some point in the future on this channel, so if you don't want to miss that, get subscribed. The point is that when you're reading, don't just read for facts. Extract the data points, but try to think of the context. What did these people feel? What's the emotional texture of their experiences? What is it that the author is trying to convince you of? Be suspicious. Is what's being said here really true? And you don't have to throw away your empathy, but by interpreting with a bit of suspicion, well, that's where the real understanding lives. And it's what separates someone who knows the facts from someone who has true wisdom. You could call it discernment. And it's really, really important when it comes to memory because there is something called confabulation. And that's when people change their own memories and they legitimately are not trying to pull the wool over anyone. They literally have re-remembered through a process called memory reconsolidation that has changed what the facts are, but sometimes there are feelings and ego involved, but they're not necessarily trying to deceive anyone. So by reading a bit skeptically, we get more dimensionality out of the text. And the fourth strategy is building a physical archive. And I don't mean just building a library around you. One thing that's fascinating that L'Amour did is he built his own rhyming dictionary. And then as he was becoming a writer, he tracked every submission to journals and publishers and every rejection. And this physical system helped him also organize what he was learning because he wrote down a lot of what it is that he read, and that's why we have the list at the back of the book. And, I like to do this as much as possible to physically organize all my thoughts, not only my own battered veterans of books on my shelves, but also all the notes I take are organized in a particular way, and I use the Zettelkasten technique. And it matters because something I talk about constantly on this channel is that physical media, notebooks, index cards, shelved books, when you can point to where something is, you're strengthening your spatial memory. And when you're using techniques like the Memory Palace, you're offloading a lot of that onto the world and you know where things are. You can reach for them. Your brain encodes location alongside content, and that dual encoding makes retrieval dramatically stronger, and yet so many of us are only learning from digital media, and then we're struggling to remember information because there isn't a correspondence to where that information is in space. So Lemore understood this instinctively, and he did it not just in placing books in libraries, but also in his own note-taking. Digital didn't exist for him, of course, but the principle still holds, and when your knowledge has a physical location, it has more weight, and it stays with you more completely in a completely different way. All right, strategy 5. Focus not on what you want to have, but on what you want to become. This is Lemore's deepest lesson, and it's the one that brought me almost to tears while reading his memoir. He said his idea of success was simple: a good family life and the ability to keep buying books so he could continually wander in memory. Not fame, not 320 million copies sold. He wanted to become the kind of person who could keep learning. His bestsellers were a byproduct of that desire to become. And because that's ultimately what I want, tears really did well up in my eyes. But even more so when he quoted Nietzsche. And Lemore quotes Nietzsche from memory, and it's quite interesting the way that he says it. He said, Nietzsche said it best when he wrote, "As I recall, I have a song to sing and will sing it, although I am alone in an empty house and must sing to my own ears." What's so interesting about that is that if you read the actual fuller passage from Nietzsche, which is in Also sprach Zarathustra, as it's called in German, he's actually talking about the different ways that he's not any sort of singular person. He's a collection of all kinds of people. And of course, this is a book about wandering, right? And so he says that, there are other singers, to be sure, whose voices are softened, whose hands are eloquent, whose eyes are expressive, whose hearts are awakened only when the house is full. I am not one of them. And so there's this idea of not collecting things, but rather focusing on what you're going to become and being willing to sing to yourself in the room by yourself. And, I've always been like this. I wanted to become the best learner I possibly can, not so that I can have things as such, but so that I could become more like a book myself, where my memory is so reliable that I enjoy the rock-solid foundation of knowledge and wisdom with minimal doubt. Of course, I'm only human, and I do forget things and make mistakes. But, if you're only reading to pass an exam and you don't share these highfalutin ideals and the philosophy is not exactly sticking with you, don't worry. I've been there too. In my own wandering, I've read to pass exams that got me a security guard license and a liquor license at one point so I could sell drinks when I needed a job, when I needed any job. Those were short-term goals. There's nothing wrong with just reading and having short-term memory for those purposes. But the deeper question remains: what kind of professional are you becoming through the choices of what you study? What kind of thinker? What kind of person? Now, there's another reason that Louis L'Amour's book hit me so hard. And it's not just because I admire L'Amour's ideas about the importance of reading and the elbow grease he put into researching so that he could write books that succeeded at such a tremendous scale. It's because I've lived a version of this story, and I talked about it in the beginning of SMARTER, which stands for serious, mature, and ready to embrace reality. I dropped out of high school, not in the same way that Louis L'Amour left school early. I just stopped going. I'd skip class to go to the public library before I dropped out. And then when I finally did drop out, I spent 6 months approximately just reading the encyclopedia. Not because anyone assigned it, because I couldn't stop. Something in me needed to know what was in those pages. I hid this whole excursion from school from my mom. I would pretend to leave in the morning and then hide in the forest, watch her car drive from on high, and then I would go back home and read from our home encyclopedia set. And then other times I would go into the city and I would just sit there in the library all day long. Now, I did eventually go back to high school. I didn't graduate with my friends. I stayed through the embarrassment of having to explain myself and begging to get back into school and graduated late. But the path from there to getting my PhD and becoming a professor, to building the Magnetic Memory Method project, to making this video for you right now, that path wasn't exactly planned. It was read into existence with a lot of centrifugal reading. But during my years as a professor, I became more of a centripetal reader. I didn't know that term, but I always had books with me. I read on trains, in waiting rooms. I read and I read and I read. When I was younger, I read whatever caught my attention, and then I consolidated it into what is now my core work, which is memory and learning, helping people retain what they study. But if you think about my earlier university career and my professor jobs that I had, my interest in film studies, which led me to a Mercator visiting research grant and all this stuff in Germany, that was ultimately all about memory. Film is memory. I focused on movie films and how it's a special mix of adaptation and remembrance. I didn't think of it that way, but it was all preparation during these adventures. And Louis L'Amour has a beautiful phrase for this. He calls it, this reading and this consolidation, the genius of solitude. It's the idea that when you're reading, you're not actually alone. You're in conversation with the best minds who ever lived. And you can think about the different kinds of reading. When you're reading centrifugally all over the place, you're with the best minds, to be sure, because reading a book, at least before the robots got involved, was no small feat, right? But when you're reading more centripetally towards a focus, now it's like having meetings with like minds that are focused on similar topics. So you're receiving compressed experience. And that can be across centuries, but it's still focused on particular topics. And so the conversation and the relationships with the books, they wind up producing your mind as a mind that can produce original work. So I've felt that, and I feel it every week when I sit down to create new content for you. The ideas aren't coming from nowhere. They're coming from decades of these two kinds of reading, but especially the centripetal reading that is really buckled down. And for me, it's now got to be, I don't know how many hundreds of books and articles feeding one central purpose. But here's where Louis L'Amour and I diverge, and this is the part that matters for you. L'Amour had a natural gift for retention. He seems to have remembered what he read a lot better than I do. And look, it's not a personal failing to have an untrained memory. Even with a trained memory, I fall down a lot, and it really sucks. But also, we live in a time where we do have a lot of digital media, and digital challenges memory. But there are ways that we can still remember more despite the digital amnesia problem. And we can take inspiration from Louis L'Amour, because Louis L'Amour said that education is a process that never ends. In fact, he says you could never get an education, and part of the process involves taking care with what you choose to read from whatever media, and then taking steps so that you can hold on to what you learn. And so this connects to something larger that I've been developing that will help you make choices in what you want to learn, and then no matter what media you study it from, you'll be able to use memory tools in order to get it more into the consolidation of your memory in terms of remembering, and it's called the system. The system not only helps you select what you want to read so it's much more focused in categories, but it's a free detailed training that ancient people used to read, and I hope that you'll take the opportunity to go into the system because it's going to enable you to have greater focus and greater memory. And, maybe you're going to have a delay every so often when you're trying to recall something or when you're tired. But in my experience, when you combine centripetal, very, very focused reading within categories with memory training, it works so well most of the time. So the link for the system is below this video in the description or on the screen, or just go to magneticmemorymethod.com/TS for the system. Go through it in full. It's going to change how you relate everything you learn from this point forward to other things you want to learn. I've got one more major tip for you to close everything up after you access the system. And I suggest also that you get the system and then watch my video on how to become an autodidact next, because there's another self-taught author in that video whose story will stagger you. The way that he taught himself so many skills is amazing. And that person, as far as I know, never finished a formal degree, yet he taught himself in ways that blend wild and wide, diverse centrifugal study with incredibly precise centripetal study that led him to write a book that became one of the most iconic movies of all time. Okay, before we go, Llull said something near the end of his memoir that I now think about constantly, because there's a major tip in it. He said that a journey is time suspended. And that is what reading and studying and learning is. Every time that you seriously focus on something you want to learn, you enter someone else's experience, someone else's century, someone else's mind, their way of being, their way of speaking, their way of singing, to put it in the Nietzschean sense. And when you come out of that suspended journey, you're changed. Not in a vague, inspirational poster kind of way. You're changed because you now carry knowledge that was hard-won by someone who lived through a journey of their own. And if you've trained your memory, well, that knowledge can stay. The key is to get in the zone so that you can sit still and suspend time and read long enough for memory and understanding and really good note-taking to form. And my tip for you is something I myself have to practice every day. Put the devices away. Sit with physical books. Read widely. Collect books deliberately. And then take deliberate notes in ways that really, really help you spread the knowledge physically in a way your brain can actually track. So I use the Zettelkasten technique. I've covered it on this channel. You can check that out. Physical notes are so very, very powerful. And then, of course, share what you've learned, including here, down in the comment. Above all, remember the process. Rather than focus on what your studies are going to let you have, focus on what your studies are going to help you become. Grab the system, watch How to Become an Autodidact next for more inspiration and more clues on what to do and how to do it. And until we have a chance to speak again, thank you as ever for joining me, and keep yourself magnetic.